Welcome back. In the previous videos, we learned how Docker is created using Dockerfile, and it provides a suitable environment in which our application services can run. So hypothetically, we can use it for our Node server, we can use it for our Postgres database, whatever we want, all of our services. Now, there's another tool that you actually installed when you got Docker called Docker Compose. And this is used to orchestrate our application services during development. So this is a tool that you mostly are going to use during development, but if you remember, Bruno's request is to have our Postgres and our server all running from one command without us having to set up a server and a database separately. And Docker Compose allows you to compose these Docker pieces, these different services, so that during development, you can do these things very easily. Remember our diagram here? Well, we're going to use Docker Compose, even though we've used Docker for our server. We're going to now use Docker Compose to create a container that contains all of these things. We're going to focus on the API server and the database. And in the sessions and JWT section, we're going to also include the Redis service, which will be a lot of fun. And again, Docker Compose orchestrates our application services. And it's going to be really, really fun when we get it to work. So let's get to it. Now, just a heads up, if you downloaded Docker for Mac or Docker for Windows, Docker Compose already comes with it. If you installed it on Linux, you actually need to go back to that page and install Docker Compose separately. So just a heads up there. Now, the way we can do this, that is the way to combine both Postgres and our API server into a single Docker command, is to create something called a Docker Compose file. And a Docker Compose file, once again, we create it at a root directory of our project, and it's going to be called Docker Compose, and it is a YAML file. This is just a file type that they use, and you'll see that Sublime Text or your editor is going to recognize certain syntax. So again, Docker Compose.yaml, and I've created it. And you can see over here that my text editor recognizes this as a Docker file or a Docker Compose file. Now, this is what a Docker Compose file is going to look like. We first start off with the version that we want to use. So in my case, it'll be version 3.6, which is the latest currently for me. And down below, we have something called services. And these services are what we're going to orchestrate. That is, we're going to have a backend API service, a Postgres service, and also later on a Redis service. And let's give it a name to our first service, which is the backend API, or we can call it SmartBrain API. Now we can give it different options, and Docker Compose, once again, is sort of a configuration file, so you can find a lot of these online in online documentation, but I'll show you some of the common ones. One of them is the container name. Name. And we can call the container backend because it is our backend of our application. And by the way, in YAML files, indentations like this matter. So again, keep an eye out on indentation and the way that I do things. And then we also tell it, and then we can also tell it what image to use from Docker Hub. In our case, we can just say Node, and what version do we use for Node in the Docker file? Let's just use this one. We can also give it a command. So that is, remember how we had to run npm start here? We can just give it a command when the service starts to, or the container is created and npm installed to run npm start. We can also do things like working directory. So working dir, and we'll say that this is in the app folder. And we can also do ports. Remember that when we ran the command with port binding and port forwarding, we can just simply say that we want port 3000, 3000. And then there's other options. You have things like environment that gives you environmental variables. If we want to perhaps pass down API keys, we can do that as well. But we're going to do that later on. We also have things like links, and that gives us what we want this service to link to. So if we had Postgres, for example, we can say Postgres, and it will link to that Postgres service. But we don't have one right now, so we don't need that. And by the way, we can also do things like build here in order to build our image. And instead of using this, we can say that we want to build from our Docker file, which exists right here. So it's going to build this service out of the Docker file. So let's give that a go. I'm going to actually remove that or comment it out for now. And this is how you comment out in YAML files. I'm going to save. And the way we run Docker Compose and run, let's exit out of here. I'm going to clear this so we have a bit more space. And now run the Docker Compose command. And we can simply say that we want Docker Compose build. And it's going to read this file that we just created. And I wanted to show you this error because it can get pretty cryptic with Docker whenever you make a mistake, and actually specifically to YAML files. In this case, I get this error saying that there's something wrong, and I want you to keep an eye out on the syntax that you use and the spacing that you use for your YAML file. In our case, we needed to add a semicolon here, or a colon here. And you see that even the color changed on my text editor. And if you have a good text editor that helps you out with this, it's really, really big, because even if I make this mistake, I would get this error. Make sure that all your spacing is correct, because that can be really, really tricky. Luckily, Docker Compose has really good documentation, and you can go online and find out how to structure your Compose file. Now, let's run our Docker Compose build command once again. And look at that, it's starting to work. It's grabbing from node version, where we're creating our working directory. So it's reading our Docker file because we said build from our source, which has the Docker file. It's running npm install, running the command, and everything is built using this information. So let's go over what just happened here. Our instructions told the Compose to create a service called SmartBrain API using the Docker file we created previously. We mapped the container to port 3000 so that we have access to it from our laptop. And we also ran npm start in the container to start our service. Now, we haven't really done too much different than if we work with Dockerfile. And when you only have one service, you're most likely working with just a single Docker file. The only difference so far is that we build Docker Compose to build our image instead of Docker. Now, let's run the next command, Docker Compose run, and see what happens. Oh, clear, and I have to give it the actual thing that we want to run. So let's say Docker Compose run with the container that we want to run. In our case, it's the SmartBrain API that we named. So let's just grab that and run. And we get a few errors here. So let's debug it. And we see that we're looking for path app at package.json. But if you remember, in our Docker file, our working directory is this. So just to get a point across with working directory, let's try and copy this here instead of the -app that we created, because that's where our package.json files exist. If we run the build command again, And let me clear this. And again, run our Docker Compose run SmartBrain API. Look at that. We have our app running on port 3000. And if we go to localhost and make sure we go to localhost 3000 here, look at that. It's working. That's awesome. Now let's get a bit of logging here because it's hard to see what's going on and whether we're actually hitting this endpoint. So I'm going to actually close this quickly and install a package we talk about in the security section called Morgan. And we're going to use Morgan here just for logging purposes. I'm going to add it over here with const Morgan. Want to require the package, and it's a middleware. So all we need to do is use it just like we do here. And say Morgan and give it options of what kind of output we want. I like the option combined, and we'll see what that looks like. So once again, I'm going to run Docker Compose build to build from our Docker file. You can see over here, we're running npm install. And let me clear this. All right, so we clear the terminal. We have the combined. Now, just in case you have any containers running in the background or you need to take down anything, you can just do Docker Compose down, and it'll bring back down any containers that you may have. Doesn't look like we had any, and we can just go Docker Compose build. And this is getting annoying of building and putting everything up. We can actually run Docker Compose up to bring up the container with -- build. And build, you only have to do it at the beginning to build and run npm install and everything that we've done in the Docker file. But afterwards, you can just keep running Docker Compose up. So if I run this, it's building our backend, and look at that. It is now logging backend according to the name that we gave the container. You can see backend over here. That's what this is. And it ran npm start, and you see that we're now running on app port 3000. And if I go back now and I refresh, look at that. We just got a bit of logging. If I do this 3 more times and refresh, we see that we have logging. So we've just created a Docker Compose file with our SmartBrain API. But ideally, we want to do more than that. Ideally, we can have Postgres here and Redis here. So in the next video, we're going to talk a little bit more about that. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.